When you are creating games, you are adding more and more stuff. Everything becomes more complicated to do. In this case, I need the enemies to shoot at the ship with the bullets, right? But I also have, if I would like to add another enemy here, I will need to create another array of sprites with their own array of meshes and all that stuff. What I'm going to do now is that I need a timer class. I know I can do that with the set timeout function, but that is using time instead of frames. I'm going to create my own class to do something similar like the set timeout, but I'm going to use frames. And I'm going to do that because I want to show you that you need to add some functionality sometimes when you are in game development, and that's why I like TypeScript. In TypeScript, you can create your own classes that you can implement then in your game to provide more functionality. And also, I need to treat the enemies and the colliders as a single unit. So let me show you. I'm going to start with the timer class now. I'm going to create here in the core folder. I'm going to create a new file, and it will be timer.ts. Export default class timer, and this will be a simple class to set a counter, and that counter will be on the update, and after a certain amount of time it will be executed. So I'm gonna remove the default here, just with class is fine, so the export class timer. So I'm gonna add some properties here, the active. This is a boolean to know if the timer is active. Initial counter, right? And the counter, the current counter, and a callback. And that will be a function. So I need to set a constructor, and I will accept a counter and a callback in the constructor. So when I create this, I'm just going to set the counter that I'm going to use, and if not, it will be inactive, right? So if I have a counter here, it will be optional because I can just use a simple constructor without arguments. And the callback here with a default void function, right? So I'm going to explain a little bit after I construct this. So if I have a counter, I'm going to set this to active. This active equals true, and this counter, it will be the same as the counter, and the initial counter, it will be the counter as well. If not, then obviously this will be inactive, but because I can activate that later. And the counter will be 0, and the initial counter will be 0. So this is inactive state of the timer. And if I have a callback, then I'm gonna set that to the callback property I have. I have another method here that is called process, and if this is not active, then I'm not going to process anything, right? If not active, then I'm going to return that. That's simple. And the counter, and if it's active, then this counter will be subtracting a number per frame. And if I time out, this counter is less or equals than 0. It means I can execute the callback that I set. Then this counter zero, and this active equals false, right? So if I time out with my counter, then I'm gonna set the active to false, because I don't want to be active anymore, because I just executed what I'm going to execute, right? So if this callback, if I have something on the callback, then I'm going to execute this like this here. I also have another method called reset, that I'm going to reset the timer. This counter will be this initial counter, and this the active, it will be the counter. This active will be this counter, if it's greater than 0, right? If this counter is greater than 0, because I want to reset that, I'm going to activate the timer again. I'm resetting the timer. Even if what timeout or not, I'm going to reset that to the initial state. And then I can have a setter for the counter. Right? To change the counter amount, in the case I want to change it in the middle, or if you want to set that after I create the instance and everything. That with this class I can now specify when I want to shoot a bullet to the ship, to the enemies. I'm going to show you in a moment. This counter equals counter, and then I can change the initial counter equals counter here, and this active equals counter greater than 0. Okay, I can set this count. I can call this counter here in the constructor, because it's almost the same stuff, but I'm just gonna keep it simple like this, right? This is its own setter, and you can change later the whatever you want when you construct this, right? So this should work right now like it is, like that, but I want to show you another way to group all the functionality I was talking about. So right now my enemies and my ship have the colliders, they have their bullets, their lasers, they can explode, they can have their own behaviors. So I think now it's time to implement some interfaces to start grouping all of that. So I'm going to start with the enemy. Right now I have an enemy sprite and enemy colliders, but I want to treat them as a single unit. So I'm going to start creating a new file, and it will be an enemy interface. And in this enemy, look up the letter. Yeah, in this enemy interface, I can have the sprite, which is the sprite instance. I can have the collider, which is a mesh. I can have the timer, which is the timer I just created. And I can have the explosion that I haven't been created yet. But I'm going to start with this. Babylon.js core. This is also part of the Babylon.js core, and this is part of my core folder here. That's fine. with this new interface I have here, I can start then changing the enemies in the colliders as a single unit. For instance, now I can create an array of enemies, right? And they will be an array of enemy interfaces. So I don't need them anymore. I'm gonna comment them, and of course I need to change the set enemies and the update enemies, but now with this structure. So I can go now to the update lasers. Yep, that's true, the enemies changed there. So the set enemies, I'm gonna start with the set enemies first. Now that I have this instance here, I can then create a new enemy with all those data instead to push them directly into the array, because I'm not using sprites anymore. I'm using an interface, and the interface contains the sprite, and it contains the collider, and it contains everything else. So right now those doesn't work. So what I'm going to do now is I can create const enemy1. It will be and I'm going to pass an object here, a JSON object, right? So the first property is the sprite, the other is the collider, the other is the timer, and the other is the explosion that I'm not using at this moment. So the sprite, it will be N1 because of the sprite I set here. So this sprite is the N1, and I have also a collider. So the collider is this one, the enemy1 collider that I have here, and the timer, it's the new class that I created, and then I'm going to create a new instance for that new timer. And the timer accepts a counter, and it accepts a function, if you recall that. So now I'm going to use the previous random number, and I want the timer to be between 0 and 200 units, right? Between 0 and 200 frames, I'm gonna shoot the enemy, sorry, the ship, from the enemy to the ship. And I can pass here, this is when I want the timer to shoot or to execute the function. Here I need to pass a function to shoot at the ship from the enemy, but I don't have that function yet. So I'm gonna start adding this. That's fine. And I'm gonna create the function that I need here. So I'm gonna call that set enemy shoot timer, right? And I'm gonna add this function that I have here inside, because after I execute this function, I want to reset or set the timer again, right? So I'm gonna pass here then the enemy that is gonna use this timer, and I'm gonna set, well, the enemy timer, I will set the counter of that timer, set counter for again. So the second time it will be again this random number between 300 and 400 frames. Then I can use this function when I am creating the enemy here, I can use that here, this, and I can pass the enemy I just created, enemy 1. Const enemy 1, and this is it, and the new timer. All right, I suspecting a function, right? So yeah, that works. So again, when I create the enemy now, I'm gonna add the sprite, the enemy 1 sprite, the collider for that enemy, and I'm gonna set the timer for that enemy. Now I have an enemy instance which was defined by the enemy interface I have here. I'm gonna do something similar with the chip in another video, right? So, but I have 2 enemies. So then I'm gonna pass another enemy here, enemy 2 and enemy 2. And this is enemy 2 as well, and this is enemy 2 collider, right? And with this, I have set my 2 enemies in a different structure that its own enemy has its sprite, its collider, and its timer, and all of that. Now what I can do is finally here inside the for, now I can use these enemies, then push, and I'm gonna push the enemy 1, and I can also push the enemy 2. That should be the same, that should work. Then I need to fix the other part of the code. So if I go here for the update enemies, then I can change this part here because I'm not using these arrays anymore. So what I can do now is, if these enemies in the and in the sprite, right, because enemies, right, that sprite is visible, so if this sprite of the enemy is visible, yeah, I need to put the index here. If and why you put any bullets, right? So now I was using max enemies, but now that I'm using a different structure here, I'm going to change this as well as enemies dot length, right? So I'm going to comment this at this moment, and if my enemy is visible, then I'm going to start moving that like I was doing here. So these enemies at this index on the sprite that x, that position that x, I'll move that the same, and I'm also moving the collider with this, right? So because the collider will follow the position of the enemy, of the sprite enemy. So now that I haven't grouped everything here inside the enemy structure, you still can access to the sprite or the collider with some property that we define in the interface. That's why the interfaces are pretty good, because instead to have a bunch of code, related code in different places in the code, we can join together all those all that stuff, and we can use that as a single unit. So for now, right, so I need to call, to make the timer work, I need to call it on the update also, and this method will be called inside the update. So I'm going to use also this same property for the timer, and I'm going to use the process. I need to process every frame to know that I'm timing out. And lastly, if the position, if my enemy goes beyond the port view of the screen of the level, right, if it's less than -9, then I'm gonna move again the enemy to the right. When the enemy reaches the whole level to the left and it goes out the level or the screen, I'm gonna move it back to the beginning, right? So for this, I'm gonna create a position again, a new vector 3, and I'm gonna set this random number 9, 16. I'm gonna change it from 9 to 16 in the X position, and I'm gonna change also this from -5 to 5, right? We saw something similar in the past. And finally I'm gonna set 0 for the Z axis, and then I can use these enemies, that sprite that position equal to pos. So I need the new here to make it work, right? So what I'm doing is, now on this new structure, I'm gonna iterate through all the enemies, and if the enemy is visible, I'm gonna move it to the left, and I'm gonna check the timer every time. If the enemy leaves the port view of what I'm seeing in the screen, I'm gonna move it back to the beginning so it can be part of again of the it can be visible again. So the update is fixed now. I need to fix it now, the collisions. So now it will be something similar. I'm iterating to the max enemies here, but I don't have that anymore. So I'm gonna get these enemies, that length, and I need to check here for the enemies colliders, right? It's almost the same thing, but I have now this structure here. So it will be like this. So for every enemy I have at the index position, I need to check the collider like this, and also I need to check this enemy to be visible, right? But what is visible is the sprite, but it's the same thing, the same logic. It's just that I have the enemy sprite are part of the enemy structure. It's not an array anymore. So this enemy sprite here will change the position when it receives an intersection with the laser. It will be the same for the collider here. This is not a sprite but collider, and it will be like that. And the sprite the sprite here will be set to invisible, right? And I have the same for the other enemy, but in this case I don't need that because I have all the enemies in the same array here. So with just this, it's okay. We still need to set the explosion and we need to play a sound and we need to do some stuff. But now I don't have any errors in my code. Maybe I can check the code. I can run that again and see if that works. And now it's the same thing we had before, just that now I am having a different structure and I added a timer and then I added the interface for the enemies, but it's working. It's working now. So I think this is too long, so I'm gonna cut it here and I continue with another video. Hey, thanks for watching. And if you have any suggestion or comment, just put it below. Thank you.